And we're back. So you'll notice a slight difference between this video and the last one because I'm recording this one 2 years later than the last one because I've changed the essay portion. If you noticed in the little comment on the last video, you no longer have to do a short essay on the councils or the saints. That will now be covered in the multiple choice areas of the test. The only essay you have to worry about is the big one. So let me run through these saints because that was not covered in the last video. But again, you won't have to write a short essay on the councils or the saints. You'll just have to know that from the multiple choice section. Okay, so let's run through these saints real quick. We talked about Benedict and Scholastica, who are the founders of Western monasticism. They were twin brother and sister. Scholastica was kind of a lot of her ideas were kind of the brains, and then Benedict wrote down the ideas that formed the rules for how people ran a monastery. They called it the rule of the monastery, is basically the constitution. Benedict wrote the first one that was influential on, well, not the first one, but the best one that was most influential on later monasteries and how they ran. Catherine of Siena is super smart nun from the Middle Ages that convinced the Pope to return to Rome from Avignon, thus ending the Avignon papacy. Thomas Aquinas is the most famous medieval theologian. We'll talk about him later in the year a lot. Moving on to St. Francis of Assisi. Sorry, we had a couple interruptions there. Moving on to St. Francis of Assisi, who founded the Franciscans. They're the most famous mendicant order. They lived very poor and they lived very simply. They were called the Little Brothers, the Friars Minor. She was, Clare of Assisi was a noblewoman in the town of Assisi who followed St. Francis' example and founded the female Franciscans called the Poor Clares. St. Dominic Guzman, founded the Dominicans, and they were the other famous mendicant order that preached against heresy and spread the gospel. Specifically, they were preaching against the Albigensian heresy. Leo the Great and Gregory the Great, we talked about them in Notes 4. They were the two most powerful popes of the Dark Ages and the two popes that get the title Great after them. Leo the Great helped maintain order after the fall of Rome, and he wrote a tome that convinced everyone at the Council of Chalcedon that monophysitism was wrong, and so he won the day there. Gregory the Great was also a very holy Dark Ages pope. He's known for reforming the liturgy, especially with the music, and that's where we get the term Gregorian chant. Sorry we keep having interruptions. This is what I get for trying to record during the school day. So that's all the saints you'll need to know. Again, there's no essay on the saints. That's just for the multiple choice section. All right, on to your essay, which is what we're really here for. I mean, that's the bread and butter. So the question you're answering is evaluate the following statement. The late Middle Ages were a golden age of Christianity. So you're either arguing for that or against that or some variation thereof. It was mostly a golden age. It was mostly not a golden age. So you're trying to answer the question, does this description fit and to what extent? So you're going to reflect on how this time period has positively or negatively impacted modern Christianity. You'll do that mostly in the conclusion. Your essay should have a clear thesis, yet you reflect an understanding of opposing viewpoints, what we call the antithesis or the antithesis. When something is antithetical, that means it's the opposite view. So you can find pretty much all of this in Notes 5. Also, your textbook, the end of Chapter 4 and the beginning of Chapter 5 will have some good stuff for this as well. Specifically Chapter 4 Part 2 homework and Chapter 5 Part 1 homework. I think that was, I forget what number homeworks that was, but you'll be able to find that if you look through your homeworks. Let me go through how you're going to organize this. You will be allowed to use this essay, this outline on the test, and this is kind of a variation on the 5-paragraph essay. This is actually a 4-paragraph essay where you're going to introduce your topic. And your method here is going to be different. Your method in the average 5-paragraph essay is, here's my thesis, here are my 3 body paragraphs that support my thesis, and then a conclusion, here's my thesis again restated. So that's the standard 5-paragraph essay. I'm teaching you a modification on this, and the reason I'm doing that is, one, you can take this model that I'm going to show you and expand it beyond 5 paragraphs. So you could actually expand this into a longer paper that even 5, 10, 20 pages. And then also it helps you have a strong conclusion that's not just a restatement of your introduction, which makes for a much stronger, more interesting paper to read. So instead of doing thesis, 3 things supporting your thesis and a conclusion, you're going to do introduction of topic with your thesis, Then you're going to talk about the things that support your thesis. Then you're going to talk about the antithesis, the things on the opposite side. Then your conclusion is going to say why the thesis is correct and the antithesis is incorrect. Okay? So the way you could expand this into a larger paper is your introduction could be 1 or 2 paragraphs introducing the topic and saying how you're going to explore it and introducing your thesis. Then the 2 body paragraphs that I have here, these could be many, many body paragraphs. You could spend many body paragraphs talking about the things supporting your thesis, and then many body paragraphs talking about all the things that are against your thesis. And then your conclusion could be a couple paragraphs, one saying why your thesis is right, one saying why the antithesis is wrong. So you see how you could stretch this model to be a much longer paper, which is why I'm teaching for you, so you can use it in later classes and in college, yay, and get A's on all your college papers. Okay, but for this, you're just doing 4 paragraphs. This is a basic version of this, and it's a modification on the 5-paragraph essay. Okay, and you'll actually only have 4 paragraphs here, but your conclusion will be much more important. So if you take a look at the rubric I've given you, this is what I'm going to use to grade your essay. You'll notice the conclusion is worth 1/3 of the essay grade, because that's where a lot of the thinking happens. You're going to actually be concluding something, and this will really, if you can do this in your papers, this will really strengthen your essays, not just in this class, but in all your classes. So what you got to do, you got to introduce the topic, the late Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, whatever you want to call them, okay, and whether or not they were a golden age. Okay, then talk about your method. Your method here is going to be, you're going to look at the positive and negative things about this period. And then you're going to say your thesis, whether you think it was mainly a golden age, mainly not a golden age, totally a golden age, totally not a golden age, some mix thereof. Okay? Then in your first body paragraph, you're going to say your topic sentence, which is, things supporting your thesis. You're going to connect your evidence to your thesis. So you got to find some good evidence here, and then you're going to connect it to your thesis. If you do those 3 things, your topic, your evidence, you connect it to the thesis, that's a good body paragraph there. Okay, and then you're going to get into, and this would be a good place for a good transition. So having looked at blah, blah, XYZ, now we're going to look at ABC. And then you're going to get into the antithesis, the stuff looking at the stuff that does not support your thesis. Okay, and again, you're going to connect that to the antithesis connect that evidence to the antithesis. Okay, now in your conclusion, this is where you're really going to have to do some thinking. Okay, why is it that you think this evidence is stronger than this evidence? Why is it that you think the thesis is true and the antithesis, despite all the evidence there, is not as true? That's where you're going to have to say that. Okay, so this is where your opinion really comes through. You've already stated your thesis up here and supported it here, but this is where you really got to convince people that this evidence is more convincing than this evidence. Okay? And then it's always good to end your conclusion in any paper with something to kind of leave them thinking, leave the reader thinking about something bigger. So you're going to just give me a couple sentences at the end talking about how this period has positively or negatively affected modern Christianity. And again, that's just your opinion. Okay? If you can do that, you'll have an excellent essay. So let's talk about some of the information. Now that we've talked about the structure, let's talk about some of the information that you might throw in there. Okay? So let's say, so one of these will be your thesis, and one of these will be not your thesis. I wouldn't use twas and twasn't, but I think that's kind of funny. So I'm using it here for your review video, just for your amusement, but I wouldn't use those actual words in the essay. So if you're going to argue that, yes, it was a golden age, then this is your thesis and here is your evidence. If you're going to argue, no, it wasn't a golden age, then this is your thesis and this is your evidence. Okay, and whichever one is not your thesis is your antithesis. Okay? So let's go through some things that could support the thesis that it was a golden age. It was the height of church power, and almost everyone in Europe was a Christian. By the way, all of this comes from Notes 5, so look through Notes 5. There's a lot of many devoted Christians, lots of religious orders, and Christianity is really unified as Christendom. They really see a lot of unity but amongst Christians. Not that there wasn't any fighting, but there's a lot of unity between Christians. There's a lot of really good spiritual devotions that developed. This is where the rosary comes from, devotion to relics, people going on pilgrimages, adoration of the Eucharist, praying novenas, praying the Liturgy of the Hours of the Divine Office also comes from this time. We get some awesome new religious orders like the Mendicant orders of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. You get awesome theologians like Thomas Aquinas and some others like Bonaventure. And there's also some awesome architecture, which is where we get all the medieval cathedrals and stuff from. So those are all the things that you could point to say, yes, this was an awesome time in church history. To say it was not, if this is going to be your thesis, then you would argue, based on all the violence during the Crusades and some of the atrocities committed during the Crusades, the Inquisition and some of the abuses of the Inquisition, especially the Spanish Inquisition. And you could talk about how through much of the Middle Ages, Jews were persecuted. You could talk about the Crusades and wars with Muslims. You could talk about the relationship between the church and state, how oftentimes there was corruption, specifically the pornocracy, all those bad popes in the 900s. You could talk about the Avignon papacy, how the French king had a ton of control over 7 popes in a row and was basically running the papacy. You could talk about discord and corruption with the Great Western Schism when they tried to move the papacy back to Rome, and Avignon elected a new pope, and then there were 2 popes, and then they had a council to try to elect a new pope and get rid of those other 2, but neither of those 2 stepped down. You ended up with 3 popes for a little while. The Great Eastern Schism, the controversy between Catholics and Orthodox, between Rome and Constantinople, and that split exists till today. And then you can also talk about how a lot of people in the Middle Ages had a very legalistic spirituality that was based on fear and kind of a sense that you had to work off your own sins and penances. It was a very legalistic policeman, accountant kind of God who was keeping track of all your sins, and you were racking up a debt by your sins that had to be paid off with penances. So that was probably an unhealthy spirituality. All right, so based on that, I want you to think, to find your thesis, I just want you to think which one of these is more convincing. Okay? Looking at all this evidence, do you think that this was a golden age in Christianity? Was this Christianity in its prime, or wasn't it? Okay? And whichever one of those you lean towards more, that's your thesis. Okay? And your thesis doesn't have to be totally 100% this or 100% this. It can be a mix. You can say, well, it was mostly this. It was mostly a golden age, but it had a few setbacks. Or you could say, it was mostly a really bad time in the church, but there were some good things, but it was far from a golden age. You could say something like that. So those are some examples of some theses that you could have. Okay? So whichever one of these you choose as your thesis, that's what you're going to throw in here. Okay? Your evidence would go here, and you're going to connect it to your thesis, which is, either this or this. And then whichever one you don't choose as your thesis then is the antithesis, your antithesis, which then goes here. Okay? And then your conclusion, you're going to explain why you think the thesis is more convincing than the antithesis. All right? So I know this is a new way of writing. This is a step up in complexity from the 5-paragraph essay. And even though it's only 4 paragraphs, it's actually a little more complex, but this is going to help you in the future because your essays, 1, it's easy to expand this model, and 2, it makes your conclusions much stronger. Okay, so if you need help with this, please come see me. Make yourself a really excellent outline because you'll that will really help you for the test. So I can't emphasize that enough. If you can outline it well, you're going to do well on the test. So come see me if you have issues, and good luck.